Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode. Sorry I've been away. I've been busy, and there's been a lot going on. So I wanted to do a special thing here, and this is kind of for historical context. And this is titled "The Real Story Behind the Israel versus Everyone Else Conflict." And as of this recording, Israel has conducted a strike on the suspected nuclear infrastructure of Iran. That was yesterday, June 12th, 2025, for posterity's sake. And while this isn't unprecedented, after all, they did attack a nuclear reactor facility in Iraq back in 1981, which I'll discuss later, it does open up a new chapter on the centuries old conflicts within the region. So we need to go back. Where does this all begin? And that really depends on how far back you want to go. In antiquity, the region was inhabited by the Judeans, otherwise referred to as the Israelites. Fast forward a few hundred years, and you have the emergence of a warlord who claimed to be a prophet, Muhammad, who conducted wars of conquest throughout the region. Then there were the Persians, the Ottomans, and various other Arab caliphates that laid conquest to the region, so the land has changed hands several times. Not to mention the Crusades, which is another conversation for another time. But for more recent context, we'll begin our story in the late 1800s. That's when the Jewish people fled Europe and started to return in greater numbers to the land we all know as either Israel or Palestine, depending on your perspective. So, part 1, a tumultuous history. It can't be ignored that the Jewish people had suffered greatly throughout history. They were expelled from their land by various forms of Arab conquest throughout the years, but more recently had seen horrific acts done to them during the pogroms in the early 1900s Russia. Scores of Jews were massacred and subjected to awful mistreatment. This started the migration of Jews in earnest to the Ottoman-ruled Palestine. The emergence of serious Zionism started here and continued with more momentum following World War I. In the beginning, the Jewish settlers were only seeking to coexist with the Palestinians, who had lived in the region for generations. This wasn't to say that Jews didn't also live there, as there had been a presence in perpetuity since ancient times, just not in as great a numbers. This period would see the Balfour Declaration in 1917, where the British government would recognize a Jewish homeland in the Ottoman region of Palestine. It established the groundwork for what would eventually occur only a few decades later. The Declaration also added that, quote, nothing should prejudice the civil and religious rights of non-Jewish communities, end quote, within the region. Despite the Arab Palestinians viewing the Declaration as a betrayal of their own national aspirations, these early Zionists would assist the British government in conquest of the area following the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in World War I. The territory was divided in 1920 between Britain and France under a mandate system where the British-administered area was named Mandatory Palestine. This would see the emergence of Haganah, a Jewish militia. In 1922, the League of Nations would grant Britain the mandate for Palestine under the Balfour Declaration, attempting to have a peaceful cohabitation of the area between the majority Arab Palestinians and the minority Jew and Arab Christians, which accounted for 11 and 9%, respectively. Throughout the 1920s, Jewish migration would increase during what was known as the Third and Fourth Aliyah being migration of Jewish people to the land of Israel. Over 100,000 Jews would immigrate during this time period. It was the 1930s that would see a further influx of Jewish migration in the Fifth Aliyah, where 250,000 Jews escaping Nazi persecution throughout Central Europe would enter into the territory. This would trigger an Arab revolt in the later 1930s, which would see British forces and Zionist militias kill, wound, and detain a large number of Palestinian Arabs. Estimates put as much as 10% of the adult male population of Palestinian Arabs as being killed, wounded, exiled, or imprisoned. Following the Arab revolts from 1936 to 1939, Neville Chamberlain would introduce the White Paper of 1939, which brought forth restrictions on Jewish immigration to Palestine. Fleeing the Holocaust in Europe, many Jewish refugees were turned away, both throughout Europe and with limitations of Jewish immigration into the United States. The Aliyah Bet was organized to bring Jews to Palestine, and by 1945, the Jews now comprised 31% of the overall population in the region. This saw conflict between Haganah and the British, with refugees and Holocaust survivors aboard ships being intercepted and placed in detention by the British. On July 22nd, 1946, Irgun, the National Military Organization of the Land of Israel, a paramilitary offshoot of the Haganah, bombed the British administrative headquarters for Palestine, killing 91. This would be the start of a Jewish insurgency in Palestine against the British and Palestinian police forces. The British attempted to mediate the conflict, but both sides were opposed to any form of capitulation, and the Jews refused to cooperate unless it led to the formation of a Jewish state, whereas the Arabs refused to accept any form of Jewish state in Palestine. Anything less than a unified Palestine under Arab rule was unacceptable. On May 15, 1947, the United Nations General Assembly resolved that something had to be done with the territory and proposed a plan to replace the British mandate with an independent Arab state and an independent Jewish state, with Jerusalem falling under international trustee system. This didn't end the Jewish insurgency, however, as in 1947, July, Irgun raids took 2 British soldiers hostage in an attempt to halt the execution of 3 captured Irgun combatants. The execution still took place, and the British soldiers were killed and their bodies hanged from trees, booby-trapping the scene and injuring another British soldier. This prompted the British government to withdraw from Palestine, as they viewed the mandate as no longer tenable. This is where another thorn in the side of the Arab Palestinians was introduced. In 1947, the UN General Assembly adopted Resolution 181. This would be known as the UN Plan for Partition of Palestine. The plan, heavily favorable to the Jews, saw the assignment of 55% of mandatory Palestine to the Jews. At that time, they comprised only about 30 to 35% of the population and owned only 7% of the land. The Arabs, however, constituted the majority and owned 20% of the land. The Arab League and Arab Higher Committee of Palestine rejected the plan on the basis of fairness and indicated that they would reject any other plan of partition. This led to riots in Jerusalem and spiraled the situation into an all-out civil war. With the withdrawal of the British, this left Haganah and Irgun as the main opponents to the Arab assaults. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion, the head of the Jewish Agency, declared the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel. The following day would see the start of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, with Egypt, Syria, Transjordan, and Iraq invading what had been mandatory Palestine. Yemen, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, and Sudan would also join in an attempt to prevent the formation of a Jewish state. After a year of fighting, a ceasefire was declared and temporary borders, known as the Green Line, were established. Jordan annexed what would later be known as the West Bank to include East Jerusalem, and Egypt would occupy the Gaza Strip, a 141 square mile strip of land on the Mediterranean in southern Israel. The result of the 1948 war would see over 700,000 Palestinian Arabs flee or be expelled by Zionist militias and the Israeli military. This would become known as the Nakba, Arabic for catastrophe. This would spell the near destruction of most of Palestine's Arab culture and national aspirations. An approximate 156,000 Arabs would remain and become Arab citizens of Israel. A nation is born. UN General Assembly Resolution 273 would be a pivotal moment for the fledgling Jewish nation. It was then that the UN admitted Israel as a member on May 11, 1949. The immigration of Jewish people to the nation would soon become a priority, especially for Ben-Gurion's labor Zionist movement during his tenure as prime minister. Zionist immigrants and those escaping persecution and outright expulsion migrated to the region, solidifying the population of Israel. By the end of the next decade, the population would surpass 2 million. The 1950s would also see an increase in violence against Israel by the Palestinian Fedayeen, or nationalist guerrillas. Almost all of the attacks conducted by the Fedayeen were against civilians, and mostly originated from Egyptian-occupied Gaza Strip. The 1960s would see further issues with diplomatic tension between the U.S. and Israel concerning the Israeli nuclear program. It would also see further hostilities and increasing tension between the Arabs and Israelis over the Israeli plan to divert the Jordan River into the coastal plain, provoking further issues with Syria and Lebanon. To the southwest, Egypt would block Israel's access to the Red Sea and expel UN peacekeepers from the Sinai, who'd been in place since 1957 in order to maintain the Suez Canal as an international shipping route. Following the attack from Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, the Six-Day War began, with Israel fighting to the coalition on the north, as well as the Egyptians in the south. Israel would emerge victorious, capturing the West Bank from Jordan, the Gaza Strip and Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, and the Golan Heights from Syria. Jerusalem would be expanded to incorporate East Jerusalem under Israeli control. Another result of the 1967 war would see the Khartoum Resolution, which was comprised of a conglomerate of Arab states in Khartoum, Sudan. The resolution, issued on September 1st, 1967, became known as the Three No's. No peace with Israel, no negotiation with Israel, and no recognition of Israel. The Arab League, which had convened the summit, was made up of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Kuwait, Algeria, and the host nation of Sudan. This summit also set forth economic cooperation between the various Arab nation states and would play a role in further peace attempts like the Camp David and Oslo efforts. Nearly every attempt at peace would be undermined by suspicion that the Khartoum Resolution was at the forefront of the Arab delegates' motivations. This would also see the rise of Palestinian groups like the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, established in 1964 for the sole purpose of committing to, quote, armed struggle as the only way to liberate the homeland, end quote. The attacks would rage over a decade, including the massacre of Israeli athletes at the 1972 Summer Olympic Games in Munich. This would lead to the Israeli government responding with an extensive assassination campaign against the planners and organizers of the massacre. Another notable act of terror against Israel would be the 1976 hijacking of a flight from Israel to France by Palestinian terrorists, where they would land the plane with their hostages at Entebbe Airport in Idi Amin-controlled Uganda, which would result in Israeli commandos rescuing 102 of the 106 Israeli hostages in a daring and incredible raid. Prior to that, in October of 1973, Egypt and Syria would launch a surprise attack against Israeli forces in Sinai and Golan Heights, triggering the Yom Kippur War, which would end 19 days later with Israel repelling the attacking forces, but suffering great losses. This also would lead to the resignation of Golda Meir, the Prime Minister of Israel at the time. The history between the Arabs and Israel, while seeing peaks and valleys throughout history, culminated in an eventual peace between Israel and Egypt during the Camp David Accords in 1978. This led to the Israeli withdrawal from Sinai and an agreement to enter negotiations over the autonomy for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Naturally, under Menachem Begin's Likud party, which took control from the Labour Party in 1977, would shift to backpedaling from peace with the Palestinians following PLO guerrilla attacks originating in Lebanon. This would result in Israeli settlement and occupation of the West Bank. In 1981, Israel would annex the Golan Heights, with the UN Security Council viewing this declaration as null and void. That year would also see the outbreak of the Iran-Iraq War and the execution of Operation Opera, where a flight of Israeli F-16s would conduct a daring bombing raid on Iraq's sole nuclear reactor, under construction at the time and backed by France. The intent of this operation was to impede Iraq's nuclear weapons program, although to this date no evidence has been found to support that the facility had any weapons-grade material or technology, and many experts claim that it was strictly for peaceful energy production purposes, to include the official stance of the French government at the time. The 1980s would see further conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians, culminating in the First Intifada, a Palestinian uprising against Israeli rule which began in 1987. The 6-year-long Intifada would see over 1,000 people killed. The PLO also backed Saddam Hussein's missile strikes against Israel during the 1991 Gulf War, an attempt to get Israel to enter into the war and threaten to shatter the U.S. Arab coalition that endeavored to liberate Kuwait from the aggressing Iraqis. The plan failed and showed the diplomatic power that the U.S. held with regard to U.S.-Israeli relations. The following year, after Yitzhak Rabin, a Labor Party member, was elected for a second time as Prime Minister of Israel. Rabin would be instrumental in negotiating some semblance of peace with Yasser Arafat and the PLO in the 1993 Oslo Accords at the White House. The Oslo Accords would give the Palestinian National Authority, PNA, the rights to govern parts of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. The PLO would also recognize Israel's right to exist and pledge to put an end to the terrorism. In 1994, Israel and Jordan would sign a peace treaty, making Jordan the second Arab nation to normalize relations with Israel. This peace with the Arabs in the region would be short-lived, and the continuation of Israeli settlements and checkpoints, as well as the deterioration of economic condition in the Palestinian territories. Support for the accords among Israelis would also suffer after a multitude of Palestinian suicide attacks. In 1995, Rabin was assassinated by Yigal Amir, a far-right Israeli who opposed the accords. Following this assassination, another proponent of the two-state solution, Shimon Peres, would become prime minister. Only a year later, he was narrowly defeated by Benjamin Netanyahu, a prominent member of the Likud Party of Israel. The tumultuous 90s would see many promises made not kept with the Netanyahu administration, such as the agreement to withdraw from Hebron, a Palestinian city in the West Bank, as well as the Wye River Memorandum, which was supposed to implement an agreement on the West Bank and Gaza Strip, but following the Palestinian terror attack in Jerusalem, both parties would withdraw following accusations that both parties had failed to fulfill their responsibilities under the agreement. The end of the decade would see the Labor Party come back into power in 1999 with the election of Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who withdrew forces from southern Lebanon and entered into negotiations with PNA chair Yasser Arafat at the 2000 Camp David summit. Barak offered a plan to establish a Palestinian state, including the entirety of the Gaza Strip and over 90% of the West Bank, culminating in a sharing of Jerusalem as each state's respective capital. The talks would ultimately fail, with both sides placing blame on each other. The next few decades would see further conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis, with attempts at peace tried and failed numerous times, including Barak's resignation in 2001 and the election of Likud's Ariel Sharon, who would end the Intifada by withdrawing from Gaza and constructing the West Bank barrier. For the next several years, however, Israel would still maintain control over Gaza and the West Bank, limiting trade and control of natural resources in both territories. In 2005, Israel would withdraw all settlers from Gaza and allow for limited autonomy of the area, seeing the election of Hamas as the de facto leadership of the Palestinians in Gaza. It should be noted, however, that while Hamas was essentially the leadership of Gaza, it exercised very little economic and external relational control over the area. Meanwhile, the West Bank continued to see Israeli control exercised over their external relations as well, and resources like water were tightly controlled by Israel, resulting in an ongoing water crisis for the Palestinian residents of the West Bank. The Gaza War. By now, most are aware of the horrific attack conducted on October 7th of 2023, near the Gaza border during a music festival in the southern district of Israel. 1,300 Israelis, mostly civilians, were killed, with over 200 hostages taken to the Gaza Strip. This would start the Gaza War, which would see the conflict expand to an extensive bombing campaign resulting in thousands of Hamas fighters killed, as well as varied estimates between 30 and 50,000 Palestinian civilian casualties. Reports also have as many as 180 journalists and media workers, 120 academics, 224 humanitarian aid workers, 179 of those being employees of UNRWA, all killed in Israeli strikes on the Gaza Strip. International human rights organizations estimate as many as 80% of Palestinians killed were civilians. Of note, according to Israeli media and intelligence sources, Hamas utilizes tactics where military infrastructure is hidden and stored among civilian buildings, to include hospitals, schools, and civilian apartment complexes. The complexity of the conflict cannot be overstated, that while Israel is attempting to conduct operations against Hamas and making warnings of attacks to mitigate civilian risk, the numbers do show that the majority of those killed are civilians. Regardless of which side one falls on, the fact of the matter is that civilian casualties are horrible and not justified. Where Iran fits in all of this. Israel and Iran have not been at war the entire time during the existence of an official Israeli state. Historically, following World War II, the Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran forced the abdication of Reza Shah, the monarch of Iran, and ushered in the succession of his son, Mohammad Reza Shah. The British-owned oil industry was nationalized by Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and the backing of Iran's national parliament. With the backing of Iran's national parliament. In 1953, a U.S.-backed coup d'etat saw Mossadegh overthrown and rule was consolidated by the Shah. Without going into protracted detailing of the Shah's rule of Iran from 1941 to 1979, the state of Iran saw both good and bad. While the Western-friendly nation resulted in economic and industrial growth, as well as an extensive modernization and bustling tourism industry, Iran wasn't without its own set of problems and controversy. In short, many were critical of the Shah's sidelining of Islamic tradition in favor of more pro-Western beliefs. One such example was the change in 1976 from an Islamic calendar to an imperial calendar. The aggressive modernization of Iran, known as the White Revolution, or the Shah and People Revolution, caused a lot of strife between feudalist traditionalists, adherents to a more strict observance of Islam, and the pro-Shah population. The seeming abandonment of Islamic tradition caused animosity with the ulama, Islamic clergy, within Iran, led by Ruhollah Khomeini. While the White Revolution saw a rise in industrial development, economic growth, rapid urbanization, and spread of literacy, it also saw slow absorption of newly educated youth into the labor market, resulting in increased unemployment. It also saw multiple human rights abuses and political repression, leading to a growing sentiment of distrust and fear of the country's leadership. The secret police employed by the Shah, the Savak, established with the assistance of the CIA and Mossad, engaged in torture and execution of political prisoners, surveillance, intimidation, censorship, and the crackdown on protest and political dissent. In 1978, the Black Friday Massacre on September 8th was the result of government troops opening fire on protesters in Tehran's Jaleh Square. Estimates range from 64 to 100 protesters killed. This massacre would be the linchpin and would later spark an all-out revolution. In an attempt to calm tensions, the Shah granted amnesty to dissidents living abroad, including the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a prominent and highly influential political and religious leader. This move would unintendedly spell the beginning of the end of the regime. The American administration, led by then-President Jimmy Carter, had failed to acknowledge that Iran was on the brink of an all-out revolution. Ayatollah Khomeini began to publicly outline the abuses of the Shah and his government, culminating in the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The revolution saw the exile of the Shah, who fled to Egypt and was welcomed by then-President Anwar al-Sadat, then to Morocco as a guest of King Hassan II. The Shah's welcome to Morocco revealed ulterior motives, as the Moroccans believed the Shah to be worth upwards of $2 billion. This led to the Shah moving to the Bahamas, then Mexico. Eventually, his health would decline and he would be welcomed in the U.S. for treatment by the Carter administration, who not only allowed for him to be allowed to seek treatment in the U.S., but also gave him preferential treatment with transport aboard U.S. military aircraft and treatment at U.S. military medical facilities. This caused intense resentment with the revolutionary movement within Iran, who saw the U.S.-backed overthrow of Prime Minister Mossadegh and the years of support for the Shah as complicity in his multitude of abuses. The refusal by the Carter administration to hand over the Shah to Islamic Iranian courts for the crimes and abuses he committed against his people led to the hostile treatment of the U.S. as an enemy to the revolutionary regime, culminating in an uprising that resulted in the siege of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and the taking of U.S. hostages. The revolution and hostage crisis that ensued tarnished and destroyed all positive relations between the United States and Iran. With regard to Israel, the relations between the Shah and Israel were good. Iran was the first Muslim-majority nation to recognize Israel. They cooperated in trade, military intelligence, and natural resources, predominantly oil. Following the Islamic Revolution, however, relations between Iran and Israel quickly deteriorated, and Israel was viewed by the new Iranian regime as the, quote, Zionist enemy, illegitimate and a threat to Islam. Iran became strong anti-Israeli, linking it with opposition to U.S. influence. Due to the close relationship between the U.S. and Israel, Iran viewed both of them as a conjoined foe. While not directly responsible for their formation, Iran became staunch supporters of groups hostile to Israel, such as the Lebanese militant organization Hezbollah, formed in 1982, and Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza and the West Bank. Iran has used these organizations as proxies in an attempt to end the occupation of what they view as Muslim lands by the Israelis. The nuclear problem. While many international organizations, such as the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, and others, have indicated that Iran does not have the capability, or does have the capability, to eventually develop nuclear weapons, it is of note that there is a stark difference between enriched uranium for energy uses and weaponized uses. Iran currently possesses advanced enrichment technology such as IR-6 and IR-8 centrifuges. Iran continues to insist that the enrichment processes are for peaceful energy purposes. Opponents also cite that if Iran did have aspirations to produce nuclear weapons, they are not party to any international treaty prohibiting their production and possession of such. Iranian officials also cite the possession of nuclear weapons would act as a security guarantee against further aggression. Some have even gone as far as stating that Iran's possession of nuclear weapons is no more of an international threat than that of the US, Russia, China, UK, France, Israel, Pakistan, and India. While international experts also cite that Iran only possesses 60% enriched uranium, not quite to the grade of 90%, which is what is required to be considered weapons grade. Officially, Iran does not have a tested or operational nuclear warhead, nor do they have verified evidence of an active weaponization program. There is no intelligence consensus on the potentiality of a fully functional nuclear weapon for Iran, as estimates vary from months to years, even decades, before they even possess the capability to develop a usable nuclear weapon. While the issue at large is fear that if Iran becomes armed with nuclear weapons, their willingness to use them in a hostile act is still questionable. Much like the idea of MAD, mutually assured destruction, which was prevalent in keeping the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union from becoming an open nuclear exchange, it is of specific note that many nuclear experts agree that Iran is well aware of the fact that aggressive and unprovoked use of nuclear weapons in the future would result in retaliatory actions from the US and Israel, if not others. The fear that Iran would make good on its many threats to completely destroy Israel if they ever achieved nuclear weapons capability is valid. The actual implementation of such an act of aggression would most certainly result in the complete and total destruction of Iran. Logically, no Ayatollah or other leader of Iran would ever have the desire to rule over the radioactive ashes of the former Islamic Republic. Regardless of the position on the proposed Iranian nuclear weapons program, one thing in recent events is evident. An unprovoked and devastating attack on the sovereign nation of Iran by Israeli military is an act of war, one in which no proponent of peace should ever support. And regardless of which side one stands on, Iran and Israel are both guilty of atrocities, aggression, and harmful rhetoric against one another. In conclusion, one has to recognize that while Israel comes from a tumultuous and varied background, complete with tons of animosity and tons of strife for the Israeli people and the Jewish people at large, it also should be of note that Israel is not 100% innocent in all of the conflict that it has been party to throughout the decades. And in fact, Many opponents to Israel support the Israeli people while decrying the acts of the Israeli government, such as, while not directly targeting the actual catastrophic death of multiple civilians in Palestinian territories throughout the years, as Israel has conducted what some call defensive attacks, but others call open acts of aggression against the Palestinian people. Many have criticized Israel of being an apartheid-like regime, but also others state that Israel has a right to defend itself. The truth may lie somewhere in between. And while Israel has a right to exist, it should also be of note that the nation of Iran does as well. And while Iran's tyrannical and authoritarian Islamic regime has been absolutely horrific for the Iranian people, leading to multitudes of strife and downtrodden results, as well as multiple international sanctions against the nation of Iran, which has led to economic and food scarcity within the Iranian Republic. It should also be deeply recognized by everyone that no matter which side of this conflict you find yourself on, everyone should agree that the death and torment and maltreatment of innocent civilians should never be tolerated, regardless of which side is acting in which capacity and with which motivations. And hopefully in our lifetime we will see peace pervasive among Israel and the surrounding nations, to include Iran. Now, this is not to say that Iran is free from criticism, as the Iranian Islamic Republic has stated many times, death to America and death to Israel, and has insisted at multiple points in their harmful rhetoric that they will be absolutely unsatisfied with anything less than the destruction of the great Satan of America and the complete erasure of Israel from this earth. So the criticism of Israel and their actions and what they have conducted in recent times is valid. This is in no way a condoning of the acts of Hamas, of Iran, and of Iran-backed organizations that have continued to conduct horrible terrorist attacks against the Israeli citizenry. Further, it should be of note that while there are valid criticisms of both sides, the situation is far more complicated and far deeper than just what the broad strokes of this presentation has concluded. While everyone has their corner that they respectively retreat into, especially with regard to Israel, as some people say that they wholeheartedly back Israel or they wholeheartedly oppose Israel, it doesn't matter to which degree you view someone's opinions. It matters that you respect that everyone is coming from one perspective or another in viewing the actions of each state and of each organization from a different perspective. While Hamas is a terrible organization that has conducted atrocities, Israel is not innocent in all of this either, as they've been responsible for the deaths of many, many civilians, whether intended or not. And that's the important part. And the other thing to keep in mind, the criticism of one is not an endorsement of the opposite. And also it should be of note that criticism of Israel or condemnation of Israeli military action is not a form of anti-Semitism. It's a form of reaching out and trying to touch the base of humanity behind all of this, and in trying to accomplish some sort of goal to prosper peace instead of outright warfare throughout the world. Because at the end of the day, all people should want peace, and anyone who seeks war just shouldn't be given any attention or any highlighting because war in and of itself is awful and terrible. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Freedom Factor.